Okay, everybody. So we're going to zoom in today and look specifically at Hitler's Lightning War, which is the English version of his blitzkrieg technique that he used to invade parts of Eastern and Western Germany throughout the late 1930s and early 1940s. Last chapter, we looked at how major world leaders appeased him time and again, and how that ultimately emboldened him to basically carry out the attacks that we're going to look at in this section. All right, so one thing to keep in mind as we focus today is that, as opposed to the war in the Pacific, the war in Europe could in many ways be called a war for land. We know that Hitler's ultimate quest was to get as much Lebensraum, or living space, for his Third Reich, which is the Third German Empire that he was looking to establish. And ultimately, to that end, he went after all of these countries around him that he seemed able to take over rather easily, but we're going to look at in many cases it was a little bit more complicated than the history books might lead you to believe. So just to remind you, what the Blitzkrieg basically encompassed was, number one, heavy and light bombing techniques of the front lines by Hitler's Condor Legion, followed up by heavy artillery and small light tanks to go in and clear what's left up by the planes, and then finally his foot soldiers and infantry coming through to ultimately take and totally possess the land that they were looking to invade. All right, so the first thing to cover is this. Like in World War I, the Germans needed a way to avoid a two-front war. So as opposed to the Schlieffen Plan that we studied last chapter, one of the things that Hitler was able to brilliantly orchestrate was a non-aggression pact with the Soviets. And remember, even since Mein Kampf was published, Hitler had spoken about how evil the Soviet and Communist Empire was. His hatred for Joseph Stalin in particular was so vocalized and so obvious that it seems weird that he was able to orchestrate this plan. But Hitler was able to tap into what made Stalin Stalin. And ultimately, by giving him the promise of having access to the Baltic countries and having no challenge from the Germans, he was able to get the Soviets to acquiesce and sign off on this non-aggression pact. And most importantly, the agreement was that they would both invade Poland and split it up amongst themselves. Remember, Poland didn't officially exist on the map before World War I, and therefore both countries felt like they got shortchanged at the end of the war when they gave up that territory. So the pact they signed was called the Molotov and Ribbentrop Pact. That represents basically I guess in our country it would be called the Secretary of State, but like a head of State Department. For the Soviets was Molotov, and it was Ribbentrop for the Germans. They got together and orchestrated that. The political cartoon at right kind of has a tongue-in-cheek commentary about the Soviets and the Nazis joining together in this unholy marriage to try to get Poland amongst themselves. So I like this political cartoon at left as well. You have Hitler and Stalin kind of bowing to each other and pointing out the fact that they both hate each other's guts, but they're going to mutually come together to make sure that they can get access to Poland. Here is Stalin here shaking hands with Ribbentrop after they signed the non-aggression pact. Notice Stalin's cigarette always burning in that left hand. All right, so the map here in front of you showcases both armies' invasion techniques. The Germans invaded on the 1st of September 1939, and the Soviets later that month. But by the end of September, Poland was all but conquered by both countries. Notice, of course, as you look across Poland, you have Warsaw, Krakow, Lodz, all these places that will eventually become infamous ghettos or sometimes concentration and even extermination camps. All right, so the invasion of Poland, according to many historians, is the beginning of World War II. We as a class, at some point this week, will discuss what some other historians point to, and we'll ultimately have to come up with an argument. But this is a logical date because it is the first active and aggressive invasion by Hitler's army of a sovereign state that bordered his. So the Poles were ill-prepared. A lot of historians will suggest that the Polish army was basically riding around on horses fighting against German tanks, which is partially true, but not altogether the entire story. The Poles actually did put up a pretty serious fight, but if you consider the fact that the Germans were so well prepared, they'd been practicing their blitzkrieg for about 4 or 5 years now after the Spanish Civil War, and then of course with the Soviets coming in from the east, they really had no chance. So what's interesting is that Britain and France almost immediately, I believe on the 2nd of September, declare war on the Germans. But what's important to note is that the Poles were rightfully upset because both Britain and France did nothing about it. And in fact, the first few months of the war have actually come to be known as the phony war because there was no real fighting between the British and the French. They basically allowed Hitler to take what he would from the Poles. Many would argue that it was another version of appeasement. But in April of 1940, Hitler attacked and quickly captured Denmark and Norway. He was expanding his horizons. The blitzkrieg was working, and all of Europe was terrified of it. These are just a couple images. I like the one at right. This is a Soviet propaganda piece. It's supposed to show a Soviet soldier here being welcomed by an ethnic Russian in Poland, kissing him squarely on the lips there. Of course, if you remember, that's what the Germans always said, like when they invaded the Sudetenland and other parts of Czechoslovakia, they claimed that they were there to liberate or save their people. It's important to note that the Soviets and their massacres throughout Poland were totally heinous. And the most famous one is pictured above, the Katian Forest. This mass grave was revealed in the 1950s. Historians estimate that as many as 22,000 innocent people were rounded up and massacred by the Soviets. And keep all of this in mind because in 2 years from the time I'm talking about, the Americans, the British, the French, so on and so forth, will all be allied with this evil force. All right, so with Poland conquered, Hitler turns his attention westward and starts to quickly snatch up territory, invades Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, with really no resistance. But what's interesting is he reveals his hubris when he backs up the British and French army to Dunkirk, which is right on the English Channel. Instead of just going in and finalizing his victory against the British and French forces, he actually waits back to gather all of his troops and all of his tanks to make a symbolic and really showful campaign against these guys. And what the British were able to do was organize not only their navy, but a lot of their civilians and fishermen to get these 340,000 approximately men evacuated from the mainland of Europe over the English Channel to Europe. And it's come to be known as the Miracle at Dunkirk. And I'll show you some pretty cool pictures here. If you notice, the one on the left is French and British troops being ferried out to these big fishing ships, and some of them are smaller than others. And then the one at right, I really like this. Some of the boats were so small that the British and French troops had to leave their helmets on the shore because they were too heavy to be carried across the channel. So these are German soldiers showing up about a day too late and coming across these helmets. All right, here's a good graphic that illustrates just how aggressive Hitler and his forces were between 1939 and 1941. Literally a 360-degree radius of invasions. All right, so as we mentioned, I think last chapter, we talked about France, but I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about that. So Paris itself was invaded and occupied by the 14th of June. By June 22nd, the entire country had given in. Northern France was occupied by the Germans, and the south was left to the puppet government of Georges Pétain. That would later be called Vichy France because that was the name of the city in which he set up his puppet government. Charles de Gaulle, the guy here on the left, actually put up a resistance. He organized a government in exile in London, which means that he acted as the independent French president, I guess, so to speak, or head of state from another country. And that'll happen sometimes in war or in certain revolutions. But Pétain, of course, was the collaborator. He joined forces with the Germans and basically gave them what he wanted, most famously rounding up Parisian and other Jews and willfully handing them over to the Germans without ever even being asked to. If you get a chance, this is a great quote from Charles de Gaulle, which shows just how famous, or why, he's become so famous and beloved by the French people. A couple good graphics here on the left. This one showcases both Mussolini and Hitler with a gun and a knife to the neck of the French independent people signing an armistice here with the Germans. And notice that she's blindfolded. Notice the Liberty cap there. And then over here on the right showcases the map. There's